So I found myself Googling some of the oldest known images or oldest known photos that were taken. And I came across this CNN article that, subhanAllah, I want to share with you two of the things that were in this article. The article talks about the stories behind 10 of the world's earliest known photographs, right? So the world's earliest known photographs. If we scroll down, I found this really interesting. What was one of the first ones that they show? Is view of the holy shrine in the city of Mecca al-Mukarramah in present Saudi Arabia, 1881. SubhanAllah. You can imagine what it was like to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that time. Usually we say, what was it like for the Kaaba during the time of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi? But if we look at this image, there's no clock tower, there's no humongous hotels all around. And imagine just, sitting on any hill of Mecca al-Mukarramah and being able to see the Kaaba. And that's when the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi, when he used to go to Ghar Hira, he would have a direct line to see the Kaaba. And so he used to worship in Ghar Hira looking at the Kaaba. SubhanAllah, beautiful. But if you scroll down, look at this. This was really interesting. I didn't expect this one. This photo, I think it's probably the fifth photo that's there. Portrait of Emir Abdul Qadir, Paris, 1865. Allahu Akbar. What an amazing human being Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi. If you and I don't know who Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi is, we should all learn about this amazing human being. I don't have any photos hung up in my house, but I'm going to tell you guys something. SubhanAllah, wallahi, this is true. I don't have any photos. You come to my home, there's no family photos up. I don't have any photos of any of my teachers or anything like that. But if I was going to put a photo, if I was going to hang a photo up of anyone in my home, it would be of Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, rahmatullahi alayhi. The story, the history of this man, rahmatullahi alayhi, is incredible. He was born in like the early 1800s, I think 1808. And he died in the late 1800s, rahmatullahi alayhi. And at a young age, he was the one who led the Algerian revolution against the barbarians who invaded Algeria, the French who came in and did the most disgusting and vile acts of terrorism against the Algerian population, a population that is incredible. I know so many Algerians. Algerians are amazing human beings. North Africans in general, I love North Africans. I'm from Palestine, but if I wasn't from Palestine, I'd be from North Africa. Allah, you go to Morocco, you go to Algeria, you go to Tunis, you go to Libya. These are amazing, amazing human beings. And especially when you have a North African like Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, rahmatullah alayhi, how could you not be so happy and take pride in the fact that you come from North Africa and take pride in the fact that you come from Algeria? All Algerians out there, the fact that you have Sidi al-Emir Abdul Qadir, you can claim him, Allahu Akbar. You're already special in my heart. And so the French came and they invaded Algeria. They wanted to colonize, they wanted to rape, they wanted to torture, they wanted to kill, as is their way. And the Algerians came actually to the father of Emir Abdul Qadir, asking him to be their leader against that rebellion. To be a leader in the rebellion against these terrorists that are coming in. And Emir Abdul Qadir's father was too old. He said, let my son do it. He was very young at the time. And Emir Abdul Qadir, rahmatullahi alayhi, was an amazing leader of this Muslim army against the French. But he was a leader, and he was a military leader with ihsan, with a moral compass. And you could read the stories of Emir Abdul Qadir and how he treated his captives and how he handled the brutal French invasion of Algeria. He was a Muhammadan sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi like character. He didn't allow the harm that others did to him dictate his moral code. He wouldn't do to the captives of the French soldiers what the French, the disgusting terrorist actions that they would do to the Algerians. Why? Because Emir Abdul Qadir, rahmatullahi alayhi's Imam was Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi, and he would never trade the moral dictates of Muhammadun Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi for anyone and anything. And here's some images that you'll see that we're looking right now. It's that one, at least for me, it's the top left, maybe the top right. Can you click on that? If you could put your, where is that? Where are you pointed? Yeah, that one. Look at that. Allahu Akbar. Can you click on it again? Make it bigger. Look at this man, handsome. No regalness. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was a master poet. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was a master marksman. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was a master of horses. Like, I got on a horse. Riding a horse is not an easy thing to do. To command a horse, it's a live animal that has its own thoughts and ideas and it wants to do its own thing, is not an easy thing to do. He was a master horse rider. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was a alim. He was a scholar. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was an orator. Rahmatullahi alayhi. He was a spiritual master. Rahmatullahi alayhi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala an'am alayhi bifutuhat. I mean, many people know him as the military leader. And he was, rahmatullahi alayhi. But what was greater than his military leadership was his spiritual leadership. This is a man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave unique spiritual experiences to and openings, the likes of which many of the scholars say most of the greatest of the awliya haven't even experienced. There was a time in his life, rahmatullah. We can keep this photo up for a little bit. I love looking at him. Well, it just like, you want to talk about what it means to be a man? This is a man. This is where we learn rujula. We have all these characters popping up in modern culture who are going to teach us what it's like to be a man and how you need to dress to be a man and how you need to act to be no, this is a man. This is a man. Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi. He used to do a khalwa. He used to do spiritual retreats, rahmatullahi alayhi, in Ghar Hira. He used to go to Ghar Hira in Makkah al-Mukarramah, and he used to do spiritual retreats there, rahmatullahi alayhi. And he, rahmatullahi alayhi, used to do spiritual retreats in the Khawkhatu Abi Bakr radiyallahu anhu wa arda, in the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi. And he would be like just constantly in salah on Nabi sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi and reading Quran. And he wrote a book, Al-Mawaqif. And in there he talks about the spiritual openings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with. We're not talking about some random guy who was just sitting in a corner of his mosque his whole life and just started to say that I started to experience all these things. We're talking about the greatest military campaign jihadi leader that we've ever seen, jihad for the way of Allah and his messenger alayhi salam, in our time. Everyone has to respect Emir Abdul Qadir, the man who took down or attempted to take down the French terrorist actions when they invaded Algeria. This wasn't a man who was all talk. He was all action. Rahmatullahi alayhi. And he talks about some of his futuhat, some of his openings, that when he was in Medina al-Munawwara, in the masjid of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi, in a hal of so much prayer upon the Prophet ﷺ and a praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he saw yaqadha, in a wakeful state, the messenger of God sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi. Wallahi innahu lahaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives his gifts to whom he wants. Just because you and I don't experience something doesn't mean that others have not been blessed with it. Each one of us intellectually and spiritually have limitations. When it comes to mathematics, maybe you got up to algebra 1, but then there are other people who know calculus like it's water, no problem. But you can't grasp the concepts of calculus. All you know is algebra, and you tried, and you failed calculus over and over again. It doesn't mean that someone else can't surpass where you and I stopped. There's people that know thermodynamics. There's people that know so many different knowledges of the physical world. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives his gifts to who he wants. And Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, rahmatullahi alayh, openly talks about the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon him spiritually. But remember, this man had a very, very difficult life. He was in jihad, rahmatullahi alayh, against the French predominantly most of his life. And then after that, after the treachery of the French against him and other forces, which we won't mention right now, you can look it up in history, and he was taken to France. He was put and imprisoned in terrible conditions, horrendous conditions. And he was patient, rahmatullahi alayh, and many of his family members died in those terrible, terrible conditions. But he was such a chivalrous man that people had heard about him and known him, and the French public wanted the French government to release him. And eventually he gets let go, and he goes and he lives a little bit in Turkey. He lives in Bursa, and the home that he stayed in is still there. And then he moves to Syria, and he lives in Damascus, and some events happen there. And Sheikh Abdul Qadir al Jazairi shows the world how great of a hero he is, to the extent that Abraham Lincoln was so impressed, Abraham Lincoln, with Emir Abdul Qadir, that he sent him as a gift 2 revolvers. You can look this up. Emir Abdul Qadir has futuhat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, yeah, we know him for his military might and power and what he did against the terrorists, colonizers of the French. But we don't know about the spiritual realities of this man. SubhanAllah, this is like impromptu. This all just, just looking at him, you're just like, Allahu Akbar. We'll share one thing about Emir Abdul Qadir. Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he was buried in Damascus. He was buried in Damascus, Syria. And in 1883 is when he died, rahmatullahi alayhi. And he considered his teacher Sheikh Muhyiddin. Everyone knows Sheikh Muhyiddin from the 1200s. And he used to read his work and interpret his work, and tell a lot of people that know a lot of the things that were said about him were misunderstood. And so he was buried next to Sheikh Muhyiddin, rahmatullahi alayhi. That was in 1883. In 1966, I believe it was, 1966, 1964, the Algerian government requested from the Syrian government that they exhume the body of Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi from Syria and fly him, rahmatullahi alayhi, to Algeria to be buried in Algeria, because he was, rahmatullahi alayhi, and is a national hero. I believe he was moved from Damascus to Wahran. I believe he's buried in Wahran, rahmatullahi alayhi. So that means about, what is that? 83 years after his burial. 83 years after his burial in Syria, he's moved to Wahran. And there's a video I want to show you. And Sajjad, if you can pull up this video, there's a YouTube clip before we open up. This is his maqam, where he's buried next to Sheikh Muhyiddin. And it was a big event, I think 64, 66, something like that, in which the mashayikh were there at the time. There were some political dignitaries that were there at the time. And there were some family members of Emir Abdul Qadir that were there at the time. Now, this is 83 years after his returning to Allah. And I want you just to watch this video. Open this video up. Okay. There's the mashayikh that were there at the time. Oh, pause it. Look at this. 83 years. Can we zoom in a little bit, Sajjad? Look inside the coffin. You still see that the body's there. The body's intact. This is from the great miracles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the great gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon Emir Abdul Qadir, that his body, 83 years after being buried, was still intact, to the extent that you can search this. I believe it was one of his relatives writes in an Algerian paper that she was there and she was present. And she still saw, when his body was exhumed, the hairs on his face. هكذا are the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The men and the women of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who give their lives to the deen of Allah. ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. This is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gives it to whomever He wants. And He gave this gift to Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi rahmatullahi alayhi. Why? So you and I can see that أن Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala haqq. Allah is true. The akhirah is true. Sayyidina Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala ali is true. We will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all that's going to matter is how we lived our lives in this world. So these are just signs to us. And this still happens to this day. I read recently, and I believe it 100%, that the Sheikh al-Alawi al-Maliki al-Makki, maybe if you can look up Sheikh al-Alawi al-Maliki al-Makki, هذا الرجل العظيم, this great man, this great hadith scholar, this great man of the madhahib, of the Islamic legal opinions, this great lover of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi, who was living in Mecca al-Mukarramah, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed me to have the honor of meeting in my life. He's buried in the same burial area of Sayyidatna Khadija al-Kubra, Sayyidina al-Alawi al-Maliki al-Makki, in Jannat al-Mu'alla, in Mecca al-Mukarramah. And many of his very close students to this day, because they still go in to bury people there, they said that Sheikh al-Alawi, there he is, al-Maliki al-Makki, rahmatullahi alayhi, that when they went in and to bury someone next to him, they found that his body, rahmatullahi alayhi, was still intact. Sheikh al-Alawi al-Maliki al-Makki's body was still intact. And there are men and women, I have very close friends of mine in Al-Madina al-Munawwara who live in Al-Madina al-Munawwara, and very often after someone passes away in Medina al-Munawwara, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to take our last breaths in ziyarah of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi, and allow us to be buried in Al-Baqi', Ya Rabbi, Ya Kareem, Ameen, Ya Allah, that they have gone to Al-Baqi'. These are my local friends of Al-Madina al-Munawwara, over and over again, burying people throughout every day, because sometimes they bury two people in the same grave site, because the land, as you know, of Al-Baqi' is not that big, that when they've reopened a grave, they've seen people's full bodies there. Men and women of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The akhirah is true. Our Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi is true. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true. And everyone should know and read about Emir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, rahmatullahi alayh, this great luminary of the Muslim community, this great lover of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi.